My name is Kelsey Krebs. I use she, her pronouns. I am the senior campaign representative with the Beyond Dirty Fuels campaign at Sierra Club, which is a really long title to say that I work on oil and gas in the state of Pennsylvania. So we're here today because we're going to be talking about a new campaign that we just launched a couple of weeks ago, and I'm really excited about what this means for the state of Pennsylvania. But I'm super grateful that y'all are here tonight, and I hope you're having a good Tuesday. So if you want, go ahead and put your name and where you're at in the chat. I think it would be great to see where folks are coming from tonight. I can model. I'm coming from the Pittsburgh area. I live just outside of the city, but as I'll talk about later today, I actually grew up and spent most of my life up in northwestern Pennsylvania, around Titusville, Pennsylvania, and up in McKean County in Bradford, Pennsylvania. So I spent a lot of time there. Hi, y'all. Okay. As y'all are getting those into the chat, I'm gonna have Sarah move us forward into the next slide. And so we're gonna get into some of the meat and potatoes of this new campaign. And so in order to talk about raising bond amounts in the state, it's really important to just talk about what a bond is, because it's not exactly something that is as well known as we'd think it is. So in order to drill a well in the state of Pennsylvania, an oil or gas company has to put up a bond, which is a deposit of money to ensure that drilling companies have money set aside to close that well when it's no longer producing anything. And that's to ensure that the state has enough money to pay for cleanup should the company go out of business. It's very similar to a process of putting down a security deposit if you're renting a house or an apartment or something like that. You would get that money back if you left the apartment in good condition, things like that. So you would put this money down as a bond to start. And if you plug your well at the end of its lifetime, you get that money back. The problem is that Pennsylvania, the amount of money that we actually require as a state to be set aside to close wells is super low, and it doesn't cover the actual costs of plugging. So the money we're setting aside doesn't cover the full cost of bonding or full cost of closing a well. Then the difference of what we're putting aside in a bond and what actually it costs to plug a well, the difference has to be made up. And a lot of the times that's the state and our taxpayers like us who are on the line to make up that money and also close the actual well itself. So yeah, one more click. Thanks, Sarah. Sorry about that. So current bond amounts are just how low are they? For conventional wells, which are shallow gas wells. These aren't the frac wells that we'll be talking about in the next section. These are your shallow situations. The bond amount is $2,500 per well. Yet, according to the PADEP, who's done some analysis of their contracts for these wells, they actually estimate on average that the cost to plug these wells is actually more like $33,000. By an expert analysis that we had done at Sierra Club, that number is actually more likely to be $38,000. So $2,500 is nowhere near $33,000 or $38,000. For frac wells, the numbers are even more striking. Bond amounts are set at less than $10,000, but according to an expert analysis that we had done, they're more like $83,000. And again, these are just huge gaps. That means that the state and taxpayers are on the hook to make up those differences if a company abandons their wells. Blanket bonds are what we are also particularly egregious. So a company has a blanket bond policy. It means that if they reach that blanket bond amount in terms of their per well costs, they don't have to pay anything over that amount. In my brain, it's sort of like if I had a bond amount of $100,000 and it was for like cars, like this is kind of where my brain is going for this. I pay for every single car until I get to $100,000. And then I just get to have as many cars as I want because I've paid $100,000. It's not quite a really good example, but it's just something that's kind of saying, this is really egregious. Like, why are we letting companies do this and have just as many wells underneath the policy that doesn't cover the actual cost of closing? And this gap is really, if you take a look at all of the wells in the state, according to Carbon Tracker, which is a think tank, according to them and the analysis that they've done on these wells that we have in the state, we have around $47.2 million in bonding available to plug our wells, but it actually would cost $12.2 billion for the actual cost of plugging those wells. So that's only 3% of our wells covered, leaving the state and us to make up the difference. This is a really big shortfall. It's like having $3 for a $100 bill. Like, there's nothing covered in terms of what the state would be on the hook for and what we're on the hook for. Sorry, I got a little sidetracked. I wanted to check on something. So not only do we not have enough money to plug the wells that we have in this state, we also are dealing with wells that were never properly plugged from our history that also have to be taken care of. And this is largely because of the fact that when we were having a large oil boom in the state, these wells didn't have any plugging requirements or regulations. So Pennsylvania has a really long history of fossil fuel extraction and production. And in August of 1859, outside of Titusville, Pennsylvania, which is where I said I told y'all I grew up, Colonel Edwin L. Drake drilled the first commercial oil well and struck oil at 69.5 feet down. After that, the region became a collection of boom towns with trees disappearing and oil derricks taking their place. One of the photos here in this slide is Benninghoff Farm tableau at Oil Creek State Park. This is a replica of a really productive oil site back in the 1850s and 60s. In the autumn of 1865, the famous Ocean Well was sunk into a steep hillside at this farm. And at the peak of that well's production, Mr. Benninghoff was making around $6,000 a day in 1865. So this was a huge boom in Pennsylvania, but it didn't last. And just like a lot of fossil fuel booms and busts, it doesn't last. And in 1871, most of the production from these boom towns in the state started to dwindle. And over time, we then saw in the 1900s, conventional gas drilling popping up. And then as we move into the early 2000s, we start to get things like our frack wells. Because of the history, Pennsylvania's history of fossil fuel extraction is so long, we also have a lot of issues when it comes to well infrastructure in the state. Basically, we're dealing with old wells in some parts of the state while simultaneously dealing with newer frack wells. And many of the oil wells that I just talked about were never marked or properly closed in the 1800s. Drillers weren't required to get permits to drill wells like they are today, and nor were there any closing requirements or standards to take care of those wells once they're producing. Essentially, you could just pop up oil wells on your property if you had the means. But because of this, drillers actually left a ton of their wells that just litter Pennsylvania's landscapes. And as a result, DEP actually, through the Oil and Gas Act, is in charge of taking care of these wells whenever they find them. DEP has located and tracks around 8,534 of these wells in its database that they know about. But the funny thing about these wells is that those are really low numbers, and there's an estimated 200,000 plus wells that we don't know about. And so we're kind of stumbling upon this infrastructure at times, and those also need to be plugged and taken care of. There's a lot of issues with plugging these wells. Their location can be really tricky to get to. I just mentioned that really specific well at Oil Creek State Park with the Benninghoff farm, and that was on a hillside. So if you can imagine having to get giant pieces of equipment into the woods, into stream beds where some of this really old infrastructure from the 1850s is located, most of the time it's a really hard job. You also have to take into consideration, sometimes they're in stream beds, sometimes they're in homes, sometimes trees and things have grown over these pieces of infrastructure and wells. But for the most part, yeah, sometimes they're just like kind of stumbled upon in the woods. I've definitely seen my fair share of abandoned wells, but at the same time, I've seen them in proper places where we know where they're located. So that's the other issue, is when sometimes you're just out there and you just stumble upon this stuff. Yeah. But one other aspect of this program is that this program doesn't receive the amount of money that it needs to in order to close and take care of these wells that DEP knows about. The funding for this program is from $150 and $250 surcharges that drilling companies pay when they apply for a drilling permit. And over time, special funds have been used, but those funds are often robbed for other purposes. And so this funding is really lacking to actually plug a lot of our old wells that are causing a lot of problems. And on this next slide, this is actually a screenshot of the location where Drake's Well Museum, that old historic oil well that I was talking about, is located. And it's showcasing the abandoned, orphaned, and plugged wells that DEP has taken care of in this area. It's highlighted by the different colors, which I know are a little hard to see, but the blue ones are plugged wells. The orphaned wells, which means we don't know where who the owner is, are the red and they're unplugged. And the abandoned wells means that they are unplugged, but we do have a viable owner to hold responsible for plugging. And so this is just a really like zoomed in example of the start of all of our well problems and how we're still dealing with even those historic wells today. And part of that is because of the fact that we just didn't take care of them at the time, that they needed to be plugged and have regulations. So on top of having really low bond amounts for the state and having us be on the hook for the money to cover all of the states that are current, or all of the wells that are currently active, we're also taking care of a massive amount of historic wells and money and time and plugging resources from the state and DEP.
Can I just make a quick statement, Kelsey?
Yeah.
So the colors that are used from the DEP website might be a little difficult for some people to see. So for those of you who might have like red-green color blindness or anything along those lines, the majority of the green dots are centered around Petroleum Center, and the red dots are off to the left-hand side of the screen and on the very bottom of the screen. Otherwise, it's mostly blue.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. I really appreciate it. So I've thrown a few different well definitions at y'all throughout this presentation, and I'm just going to touch on this really quickly because the overarching theme here is that all of these wells in some way, shape, or form are a problem, and all of them are unplugged and need to be taken care of. So an abandoned well is a well that's no longer producing anything and no longer connected to any sort of piece of infrastructure to get that gas to a different location. There is an identifiable owner who can be held responsible for its plugging. Excuse me. In a DEP presentation from October of last year, there was around 100,000 conventional wells, so those shallow gas wells that are active, but around 40,000 of those wells never reported production, and it's possible that those 40,000 wells will become future liabilities and become abandoned. So that's the kind of like mass abandonment that we're worried about, and not having enough money set aside to do that plugging means that that's going to be a lot of wells the state would have to take care of and in turn come back to us in our pockets. A couple of other well definitions include inactive and low producing wells. Having these kinds of wells is one way that companies prolong closing their wells. An inactive well is essentially a special definition of wells that DEP, you have to meet a certain criteria in order to be deemed inactive. And to achieve that status, you have to apply for that status and meet a certain criteria. And usually it means that you're going to be putting that well that may not be producing much right now, or it's good to take it off the market. It just means that you're going to be taking it off the market for a while and having it be taken out of production, but you're having the plan to put it back into production. Because if you weren't ever going to put it back into production, it would be classified as abandoned and need to be plugged. So low producing is also just the exact same thing that it sounds like. It's low producing, but when you're low producing a bunch of wells, those are also still really not great for the environment. And so it's a way that you're kind of prolonging the well's lifespan. They're not as productive, and you'd be probably looking at filing for inactive statuses or abandoning those wells in the process of moving forward. And an orphaned well is a well that was abandoned prior to April 18th, 1985, that has not been affected or operated by a present owner or operator, or from which there isn't one. And so a lot of those wells that we were talking about around Titusville and around the oil boom are more so orphaned. We don't have any viable owners to attach plugging requirements to. And so that is what orphan wells are. And I know that those technical definitions, this is sort of just one way that I feel industry language kind of gets the better of us, but it is something to move forward. This is just a wonky way, I guess you could say, of making this a lot more confusing than it needs to be. And I even get confused even sometimes now, having done this work for a couple of years. So
we had a question from Diana Kelsey. In the definitions, is owner the company or the property owner?
So that's a really actually interesting and tricky question, because a lot of the times I'm referring to it as the company, but there are some times where a landowner is responsible, just based off of contracts or how land switching has happened, or like buying and selling land and things like that. So it actually could depend. But for the most part, when I'm saying owner, I'm referring to a company who's in charge of that well. So abandoned and orphan wells and all of these unplugged wells that I'm sort of talking about from our history are an issue because they're causing a lot of different problems. One of the biggest ones is that they are leaking methane. And methane is 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide in driving the climate crisis. The most recent climate report from the IPCC emphasized the need to focus on cutting methane specifically in order to avert the worst of the climate crisis. And methane from abandoned and orphan wells actually plays a significant portion of our emissions in the state, somewhere between 5 to 8% of our annual anthropogenic methane emissions. So this is like 200,000 to 250,000 passenger cars worth of methane here annually. Another piece of this is these wells are sitting around in our backyards and in our woods and everything else, and they can be really harmful when they get into water supplies. They can contain pollutants such as barium and chloride and arsenic, which are known carcinogens. And if methane from unplugged orphan wells leaks into groundwater, it can create a really foul-smelling odor and turn to toxic hydrogen sulfide when it oxidizes. There's also an explosion hazard. The decaying wells leak methane into the air, water, and soil and can create this explosion hazard for nearby homes. And I believe there was a property back in 2011 that actually was damaged from an abandoned orphan well. Property values also decrease when you live near abandoned wells. It can be really costly to remediate an abandoned well, and landowners and developers may decide not to build structures next to them, either because they tie up the land or because they're perceived to be unattractive and dangerous. So they can really mar communities. And then I've already mentioned the cost that they play to tax owners and sometimes to landowners who are responsible for taking care of these if it does fall to their property. So this is an overview of the DEP map of known abandoned and orphaned wells. And I wanted to showcase this map to you because I'm going to show another map to you in the next slide that really talks about why I do this work, because this map really mirrors my own life and my own reason for wanting to do this work and kickstarting this campaign with a really awesome team. Oh, can I have you go back one click? Are you able to do that? Thanks, Sarah. So as I was mentioning before, that map really closely ties to this map here, and this map here represents a lot of my life. And that first one, so there's that really top marker on the map there in McKean County. That's where I would have gone to college. The one as we move further a little bit down onto Venango and Venango near Forest County is where Titusville is located, which is where right outside of where I grew up. And then where I currently live is in Pittsburgh. And so, thanks, Sarah. I was actually born in Titusville, Pennsylvania, that the location of the first commercial oil well that was drilled that we chatted about earlier. I went to Drake's Well for my 8th grade field trip in in middle school, I guess. And my grandfather was a really avid biker at Oil Creek State Park before he passed away a few years ago. He used to ride his bike on the Oil Creek State Park bike trail. He would bike the 5 miles to Petroleum Center, have an apple at the Egbert Farm picnic pavilion, and then bike the 5 miles back. And when he passed away, we had a plaque actually placed at that pavilion that says Ernie's Halfway Resting Place. The next picture shows an active oil well at the McDonald's in Bradford, Pennsylvania, where I went to college. So like while I was getting hangover food in college, I was literally next to these pieces of infrastructure ordering my McDonald's, which is really kind of crazy to think about. This next photo is from the Allegheny National Forest up in up near Bradford, Pennsylvania, in Warren. In the National Forest, there are a number of these abandoned and orphaned wells. And when I was interning with the Forest Service as a biological surveyor, we were specifically told to mark any infrastructure, pipes that we might see in the ground, decaying like spigots. Sometimes you would see, that's what you would kind of see up there, or things like this photo where they knew where this infrastructure was located, but they still made us mark it just in case we ever found something that they didn't have in their database. And I was also at the University of Bradford when a Princeton graduate student, now Dr. Mary Kang, was measuring methane emissions from abandoned well sites at our school property. Dr. Kang's study was the study that found that leaks from these abandoned oil and gas wells in Pennsylvania accounts for 5 to 8% of our annual anthropogenic methane emissions. And so that 200,000 to 250,000 passenger cars number that I threw out is something that was actually being studied at my college while I was there. Which is kind of crazy to think about in a full circle way. But all of this relates back to sort of like my mission statement for this work. Part of my work here is to prevent the past from repeating itself, and raising bond amounts in the state is one way that we can hold the industry of today accountable for their wells, instead of having us clean up infrastructure and pay for it like we're making those having to do with our old oil wells and the old oil well history of the state. And so we're getting really into the campaigning part now. On Tuesday, September 14th, Sierra Club, in partnership with our great friends over at Clean Air Council, Earthworks, Mountain Watershed Association, Penn Future, and Protect Penn Trafford, we filed 2 petitions for rulemaking at the Environmental Quality Board to raise bond amounts for shallow conventional wells and frac wells in the state of Pennsylvania. And what this means is that if the EQB takes up these petitions and kickstarts a rulemaking process, we then move forward into changing how bond amounts are currently structured, and also the prices that are there for we just make up that some of that difference. And we kickstart a longer process, which will be on here on the next slide to talk about the timeline. So we filed these petitions. We're going to be hearing back from the state in a matter of 30 to 60 days. And we'll have an opportunity as a Sierra Club and our partners to make some oral arguments at an environmental quality board meeting. So that means like we get to kind of come in and say why this is a problem, what we can be doing to fix it, and why it's really important that the state starts doing a rulemaking process. If the Environmental Quality Board decides to take up our petitions, then we would move into this other colored section of this slide. So that's why there's a little bit of a separation difference. The first two on the left side are a green color, and then the two on the right side are a darker blue color. And that just means that this process on the blue and the right don't happen until EQB makes a decision. And that's if they make the decision that we want them to, which is to begin a rulemaking process. This is going to be really similar to what the state has been doing with RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, as well as the new methane rule regulations. And so DEP would then take our petitions, take a look at what we wrote in them, take a look at all of the research, all of the legal documentation, all of the, like I said, research, sorry, and basically begin to draft a rule to raise bond amounts in the state. And then we'd have a 2 to 3 year process where we could be showing up to public hearings. We'd be making public comments on this draft rule. We'd get to say, is it strong enough? No. Is it, where could we be making some better comments here? Does it get to where we need to be in order to get ourselves off the hook for cleaning up and paying for a lot of these wells if companies abandon them? And in the process, after we go through a couple of different cycles of edits to the rule, a final rule, we would hopefully then see a rulemaking finalized and bond amounts officially raised. And so I know that this is a long-winded thing, but at the same time, this gets into like volunteering and ways to get involved. We'll be having some events. This is a screenshot from a website that we've created that will feature our events, letter to the editor drafts, news articles and updates, some actions to take. It's really going to take everybody who is concerned about this issue, just like I am, to be speaking up and saying that these amounts need to be much higher in order for the state to be dealing, to not have us as the ones who are making up that difference in funds. And into the next slide, that's another way how you can plug in. I know I'm so punny. I'm the worst actually. But you can sign the petition. Most of you, if you've been on this, you already did. But if you already have, you can also share the petition that we have. We'll be presenting the folks who have signed it to the Environmental Quality Board if we get to a hearing. You can share your story too. A lot of us are living next to abandoned orphan wells, and you may have a story of your own to share. I know I shared a couple of them from my past, so I'm sure that other folks here. You could write a letter to the editor or lobby your legislators. We'll definitely be having more events over time. You can reach out to Sarah and I for more information. But then one most immediate thing you can also do to get more information and just see a little bit more of these histories is on the next slide here, which is we have a couple of outings scheduled at Oil Creek State Park. So there is a morning hike on October 9th and an afternoon hike on October 9th, where we'll be talking some more about this issue. And you'll actually get to see some of the pieces of old infrastructure that I was talking about and why we need to be changing bond amounts for wells that are active now, so we don't have these kinds of things popping up and littering our landscapes, kind of like we do from our previous mistakes. So I think the next slide is just the question. So I'm happy to take Diana's question here in the chat. How does the well get plugged? So there's a long process for that, but most of it's concrete. You have to kind of figure out where all of the previous pieces, it depends also on the well, I should say that. So for older wells, you also have to sometimes get all of the old pieces of infrastructure out in a process called fishing. And they take these giant rigs that you have to like take into certain areas and get all of that pieces of infrastructure out. But most of the time afterwards, it's a combination of concrete and some other substrates that would then just fill the hole. That's still really important, because if you don't fill the hole, it's kind of just open and you can cause things like seeps of that methane that we talked about, or you can have some like land shifts at times as well. And have some sinkholes potentially. And also just alleviates a lot of that potential explosion and leaking of methane and a lot of those other issues that we were kind of chatting about. But the previous methods for plugging wells in like the 80s isn't holding up anymore. And actually DEP's been replugging some stuff that it actually plugged back in the 80s. Yeah, it's a bit more, it's just kind of like filling the hole. And also for frac wells in the state, we haven't plugged any frac wells. So that's another kind of interesting aspect, is that that hasn't happened yet. And so the full costs and understanding of that will, we have an $83,000 number for that because of some analysis that we've done from other states, as well as some of the conventional well information with well depth.
It's an interesting concept thinking about plugging a frac well as well, Kelsey, because instead of just going straight down, they also go horizontally. So
Exactly.
you have that additional step of how am I going to get the concrete several hundred feet horizontally from the entrance to the well?
And in that aspect, I don't have the full information of how that actually works, or if it does work the same way that a conventional well does. So I'd have to kind of do a little bit more research on that specifically, because I'm not really sure that the concrete goes all the way down to the horizontal, if I'm remembering some graphs that I've looked at before correctly.
All right. Do we have any other questions for Kelsey? Kona decided to start barking.
She did.
So if you'd like to come off mute, you can speak directly to Kelsey, or if you would like to put something in the chat, you're more than welcome to do that as well. This is a bit of an open forum portion of the evening.
Go for it, Diana.
Yeah, hi. Yes, sorry about the visibility here. Oh, yeah, yeah.
No worries.
Yeah. Anyway, anyway, I monitor the e-fax that, or e-notices that come in, and you do also. And, you know, you see all of these new wells being drilled by Chesapeake and a few others. And they seem to be drilling these on these old well pads where it looks like there are all these wells that have been out there since 2012 maybe, or 2015 or something. And and then there's they're applying for something like alternate method of the words are escaping me, alternate method of treating the well. And well, anyway, what I'm getting to is, do you think some of these large companies that have fracked numerous wells on numerous pads have these low producing wells that are just sort of leaking methane, and they're just sort of leaving them leaking so that they can then circle back around to them and, frack, further out horizontally? So I'm wondering whether there's an intentionality to leaving all these low producing wells. They're not quite, yet abandoned, but they're just not producing a lot either. And whether there's an intentionality about that. Well, we can't cap it yet because maybe, just maybe, we just might want to, put a compressor on top and frack that. Do some more fracking on that one. It's just as there's an amazing amount of new activity, it seems, going on at all these well pads in Bradford and Susquehanna.
I can do my best to answer that, but for me, low producing wells have mostly been conventional wells. And I've seen much more of that within the data that I've looked at from the state, in terms of, just more of those low producing wells are conventional.
Okay.
And so, but at the same time, this is also just an area that I just don't have the concrete information there for frac wells. And so I can method of keeping these low producing wells in production. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little thing here that says my internet connection is unstable. So if I look a little, sound a little robot-y soon, just let me know. But you're not wrong. It's a sort of a way that you can keep these wells into production for as long as you possibly can. And a lot of times what happens is companies will buy up these low producing wells to then massively abandon them. And there was a settlement that happened a few years ago with Diversified. And the only reason that 1,400 wells that Diversified had that are going to be slowly plugged over time because of a requirement that DEP made when they were going through that acquirement of wells. So there are ways that companies can be held liable and responsible for them if they say they like massively abandon some of these low producing wells, which is always a risk since they don't produce much. You know, economically speaking, they don't make a lot of sense. And so they do make a lot of sense when it comes to you don't have the money to plug them and you're just going to prolong plugging them as much as possible, even if they're not producing anything, or you're not even reporting what they are producing, which is another instance, like I said earlier in the presentation. But as far as the activity up in Bradford and Susquehanna counties, I mean, it's so interesting with Chesapeake because they just filed for bankruptcy last year. You know, they went through a whole bankruptcy filing. And so something like that, we're gonna see as market trends and as global demands don't match. And so it's so one of those interesting things that companies like to also talk about domestic production, but a lot of the times those global spikes and those global dips are what will control a lot of asset acquirement and abandonment. And so with with Chesapeake filing for bankruptcy from before, you saw that in the middle of pandemic when gas prices were super low and oil prices were super low. But I think that that's a trend that we'll also sort of see as time goes on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yep. Very
I know I didn't directly answer your question, but I'm happy to do a little bit more thinking and researching on that.
Well, you did. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for your work on this.
Yeah, I think it's really egregious that we only have 3% of the actual wells that are left here and currently producing covered for in money. And because of that, that's millions of dollars that the state and us are on the line for if any of those companies do just decide to be bankrupt and not plug those wells and go through abandonment. We're then responsible to make up those costs as taxpayers, and we're also responsible as the state to plug those wells, but they don't get enough funding from their plugging program as it is to do that work. There is some federal money that we're hoping for with the current climate plans, but there's also some budget reconciliation processes that are going to be happening. And we are hoping that there will be some money for plugging there because it's also really important to get these massive amounts of wells that have been abandoned from the past plugged. And we also have the workforce here in the state to do that. So it's also a good job opportunity for some of those plugging programs. So I know, yeah, go ahead, Dana.
Okay, yeah, well, changing the topic then. So we've all been reading about this new technology that can actually show methane plumes. And I don't know how expensive that is or whether that can be widely used to see these super leaky wells. And because anyway, there's this video out there on the web of this super emitting well in the Permian Basin in Texas. You saw that video. And so I don't know if that technology is, widespread or easy to use, or how would somebody know whether they have a, abandoned super leaky well that would be high priority to get, the limited amount of funds over there to plug it.
Well, and that's a really interesting aspect is just that like prioritizing which of these wells gets plugged first often happens because of like accidents, or they suddenly become really problematic because these wells are just sitting there. They're unplugged. They're not being taken care of. And so what usually ends up happening is an emergency situation where all of a sudden methane is seeping out of the ground. And DEP has to kind of go in there and take care of it. And yeah, as Sarah was putting in the chat, Earthworks has a monitoring device that measures change.
That's
And
right.
I've known that they've been doing some of that work in the state of Pennsylvania and I think New York as well, probably a few other states. And they are one of our partners. So it's really awesome that they're involved with us fighting for the higher bond amounts as well. So we'll definitely probably be showcasing some of their work because I know that they have really cool videos too, like the low producing wells that you were talking about from before. They've been showcasing a lot of those for the methane rulemaking since low producing wells are exempt from that rulemaking as currently written in the state.
All right, do we have any other questions for Kelsey this evening? If not, oh, there isn't any more slides. Oh, nope, chat.
This photo is at Oil Creek State Park, Randy. It's from the DCNR's Flickr page that they have for us all to use some of their photos from each of the state parks.
You can see it if you go on the Oil Creek outing on October 9th.
Yes, you can.
So thanks for speaking tonight, Kelsey. This was really illuminating. This recording will be shared out to everyone who's registered. We'll share out the slide deck as well. I know that Kelsey has some volunteer resources and the website page that was mentioned earlier in the webinar that'll have some like draft LTE stuff and ways to contact your representatives and all sorts of good things like that. So look forward to an email with the recording in the next few days. And Kelsey, are there any other next steps for folks that are on the call right now?
At this moment in time, it would be really good to think about just how long this process is going to be taking. You know, a rulemaking will be potentially a 2 to 3 year process. And so there's going to be really ample opportunity to have some public comments at hearings or talk to your legislator or write that LTE that Sarah was just mentioning. And we'll be creating LTE hangout parties at times to potentially do some more of that. It's going to be a long process, but I'm trying to make it as fun and delightful to be a part of this campaign as it possibly can be. Bond amounts are not quite the, I want to say, the jazzy topic. It's something like, well, I don't have an example off the top of my head. It's just too late in the day. But at the same time, it's really important that we change this so we don't have the same problems that we're dealing with from the past. And we are seeing some of that. So it's one way that we're getting the state off the hook and us off the hook for a really just egregious number, you know, for the differences in how much it costs to plug a well versus those bond amounts I showed y'all from an earlier slide. So.
All right. Well, we will let you all enjoy the rest of your evening a little bit early tonight. But before we go, can we all just come off mute for a second and do a big woohoo that Pennies got canceled?
Yes.
Speaking of dirty fuels and gross fracked gas, that's a huge win. So yay.
Keeping fossil fuels in the ground where they belong. I almost put a slide in this deck for that, Sarah. I should have. So
You should have.
I should have. I was this close.